The desert wind carried dust and desperation across the military camp as General Morrison paced outside his command tent. His withered face bore the weight of 12 consecutive failures, each one more costly than the last. The enemy sniper had claimed another life just hours ago, bringing the total casualties to 15 soldiers in 2 weeks. Captain Rodriguez emerged from the communications tent, his expression grim. "Sir, the Pentagon is demanding answers. The media is starting to ask questions about our losses in this sector." Morrison stopped pacing and stared at the distant ridge where death waited. For 2 weeks, an enemy marksman had terrorized their forward operating base from an impossible position. The shooter operated from a rocky outcrop nearly 3 kilometers away, far beyond the range most snipers could manage effectively. Yet somehow, this phantom delivered precise, lethal shots with mechanical consistency. "What about our counter-sniper teams?" Morrison asked, though he already knew the answer. "All 12 attempts have failed, sir. Johnson made it closest yesterday, but..." Rodriguez paused, remembering the talented sergeant who wouldn't be going home to his family. "The enemy position is too well fortified. Our boys can't get close enough for an effective shot, and, when they try to engage from distance, they're outmatched." The general rubbed his temples, feeling the pressure mounting from multiple directions. His superior officers wanted results. The families of fallen soldiers wanted justice. His remaining men wanted hope. But, after 12 failed missions, hope was becoming as scarce as water in the desert. "There has to be someone," Morrison muttered. "In all our forces, there has to be one person who can make this shot." Rodriguez hesitated before speaking. "Sir, there might be someone. But, you're not going to like it." The general's eyes sharpened. "Explain." "There's a civilian contractor attached to the intelligence unit. Goes by the call sign Silent. Word is, she's got skills that make our best snipers look like recruits. But, she's unusual." Morrison felt a spark of interest. "Unusual how?" "For starters, she's a woman. Never speaks unless directly addressed. Keeps to herself completely. The intelligence guys brought her in 3 months ago for specialized reconnaissance, but nobody talks about what she actually does." "There are rumors though." "What kind of rumors?" Rodriguez glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "They say she once took out 3 targets at distances our equipment can barely measure. Some of the Spec Ops guys claim she can make shots that shouldn't be physically possible. But, sir, she's not military. She's a contractor, and getting her approval for an operation like this." "I don't care if she's a Martian," Morrison interrupted. "If she can end this nightmare, I want to see her. Now." 30 minutes later, Rodriguez returned with a figure that immediately caught the general's attention. She was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 5.5 feet tall, with an unremarkable appearance that would make her invisible in any crowd. Her dark hair was pulled back simply, and she wore standard desert camouflage that somehow looked different on her, as if the uniform was just a costume she wore to blend in. What struck Morrison most were her eyes. They held a depth and intensity that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. When she looked at him, he had the unsettling feeling that she was calculating distances, wind speeds, and angles of approach purely out of habit. "You're silent?" he asked. She nodded once, offering no verbal response. "I'm told you might be able to help with our sniper problem." Again, just a nod. Morrison spread a tactical map on the table between them, pointing to the enemy position. "This shooter has killed 15 of my people. 12 of my best marksmen have tried to take him out. All failed. The distance is approximately 2,670 meters from our best available position. The terrain offers minimal cover for approach, and the target has proven extremely capable." Silent studied the map with the same intensity she'd directed at the general. Her finger traced possible approach routes, and Morrison noticed her lips moving silently, as if she was performing calculations in her head. "Can you make the shot?" he asked directly. She looked up from the map, and, for the first time, spoke. Her voice was quiet but carried absolute certainty. "Yes." That single word sent a chill down Morrison's spine. It wasn't boastful or confident in the way soldiers usually were. It was simply factual, as if she'd stated that water was wet or the sky was blue. What do you need? Time to observe the target. Weather data for the next 48 hours. And your word that no other teams will attempt the shot while I prepare. Morrison nodded eagerly. Done. How long do you need? 2 days to study his patterns. He'll be dead on the third day. The matter-of-fact way she delivered this statement made everyone in the tent fall silent. Morrison had heard tough talk from hundreds of soldiers over his career, but this was different. Silent wasn't trying to intimidate or impress anyone. She was simply stating what would happen, as inevitable as sunrise. There's one more thing, Morrison said. If you succeed, there might be questions. Media attention. Recognition. For the first time, something that might have been amusement flickered in Silent's eyes. General, if I do this job correctly, nobody will ever know I was here. As she turned to leave, Morrison called after her. What's your real name? She paused at the tent entrance without turning around. Does it matter? And, with that, she disappeared into the camp, leaving behind only questions and the first genuine hope Morrison had felt in weeks. He didn't know who she really was or where she'd come from, but something told him that in 3 days, their nightmare would be over. The desert wind continued to blow, but, for the first time in weeks, it didn't carry the smell of fear. Dawn broke over the military compound with the same harsh light that had witnessed too much death in recent weeks. While most soldiers began their daily routines, Silent had already been positioned for 3 hours at an observation post overlooking the enemy sniper's domain. She lay motionless behind a specialized spotting scope, her breathing so controlled that even experienced soldiers walking nearby couldn't detect her presence. Captain Rodriguez found her there at 0800, though finding wasn't quite accurate. She'd allowed him to locate her, becoming visible only when she chose to acknowledge his approach. The precision of this control unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Any activity, he whispered, settling beside her position. Silent didn't respond immediately. Her attention remained fixed on the distant ridge through her scope. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same quiet certainty that had impressed General Morrison. He fires between 0930 and 1045 local time. Wind conditions are optimal during that window. He's left-handed, favors targets moving from his right to left. Height approximately 6 feet, weight around 180 pounds based on the rifle stability patterns. Uses a Soviet-era Dragunov, probably modified for extended range. Rodriguez stared at her in amazement. You got all that from watching? Movement patterns reveal handedness. Timing suggests he's working within optimal ballistic windows. The rifle signature is distinctive when you know what to look for. She adjusted her scope minutely. He's also wearing body armor, but it won't matter. Why not? Silent finally turned to look at him, and Rodriguez saw something in her eyes that made him glad she was on their side. Because I don't aim for the body. Throughout the morning, Silent maintained her vigil with impatience that seemed almost supernatural. She tracked wind patterns, noting how the desert thermals shifted with the rising sun. She observed the enemy position through multiple spectrum filters, building a mental map of every rock, shadow, and potential concealment point. Most importantly, she studied the sniper himself. At 0947, the enemy marksman claimed another victim. Private Chen, barely 19 years old, had been carrying water to a forward position when the shot came. The bullet traveled nearly 3 kilometers before finding its target with surgical precision, confirming what everyone already knew: they were dealing with an exceptional killer. Silent watched the muzzle flash through her scope, her expression never changing. She noted the exact position, the slight delay before the shooter repositioned, the disciplined way he maintained concealment. Professional recognizing professional across a deadly divide. Son of a bitch, Rodriguez muttered, watching the medics rush toward Chen's position though they all knew it was too late. He's good, Silent acknowledged without emotion. But he has a pattern. They always do. As the day progressed, Silent expanded her observation beyond just the sniper. She studied the entire enemy position, mapping every possible approach route and escape path. She calculated wind speeds at different altitudes, noting how the mountain terrain created unpredictable air currents that could affect a bullet's trajectory over such an extreme distance. By afternoon, she had requested specific equipment from the camp's armory. Her requirements surprised everyone who heard them. "You want our experimental ammunition?" Sergeant Williams questioned, checking her requisition list. "This stuff is still in testing phase. The ballistic coefficients aren't even finalized. Standard rounds won't maintain accuracy at 2,670 meters, Silent explained. These will. But, the experimental loads haven't been properly tested beyond 2,000 meters. We don't have reliable data for the range you're talking about." Silent's response was typically direct. "I'll generate the data." The weapon she selected raised even more eyebrows. Instead of requesting the military's newest sniper rifles, she chose an older model that most marksmen had moved away from years earlier. When questioned, her explanation was characteristically brief. "I know this rifle. It knows me." That evening, Silent disappeared from the base entirely. Security cameras caught her leaving through a rear perimeter gate around 2100 hours, carrying minimal gear. She returned before dawn, offering no explanation for her absence. When pressed, she simply stated that she'd been confirming variables. General Morrison found her the next morning at the same observation post, still watching the enemy position with unwavering focus. "My intelligence officer says you left base last night," he said, settling beside her. "Correct. Care to explain where you went?" Silent gestured toward the distant mountains. "I needed to see his position from multiple angles. Understand his escape routes. Confirm firing positions." Morrison felt a chill. "You went out there? In the dark? That's enemy territory." "Yes." "How close did you get?" Silent paused in her observations long enough to look at him directly. "Close enough to count his spare magazines." The general stared at her, trying to process what she'd just admitted. She had somehow infiltrated enemy territory, approached close enough to observe their snipers' equipment personally, and returned undetected. The level of skill required for such a mission was beyond anything he'd encountered in 30 years of military service. "Did anyone see you?" "No." "How can you be certain?" Something that might have been amusement flickered in Silent's eyes. "Because if they had seen me, General, we wouldn't be having this conversation." As the second day progressed, Silent continued her methodical preparation. She tested her selected rifle at various ranges, confirming zero and validating her ballistic calculations. She practiced with the experimental ammunition, learning its unique characteristics through careful observation of impact patterns. What impressed the range officer most wasn't her accuracy, which was exceptional, but her methodology. She approached each shot like a scientific experiment, adjusting for variables most snipers never considered. Air density, barometric pressure, even the Coriolis effect became factors in her calculations. Most shooters rely on experience and instinct at extreme range, the officer observed. She's treating it like advanced physics. Because it is advanced physics, Silent replied, overhearing his comment. The bullet doesn't care about instinct. That evening, General Morrison called his final briefing with Silent. Tomorrow would be the day they ended their nightmare, one way or another. Are you ready? He asked. Silent nodded. He'll fire his first shot tomorrow at 0942. I'll be in position by 0930. The engagement will last approximately 15 seconds. 15 seconds? Time for the bullet to travel 2,670 meters. Morrison realized he was holding his breath. What are the chances of success? Silent gathered her equipment and prepared to leave for what would either be a historic achievement or another tragic failure. At the tent entrance, she turned back to the general. There are no chances, General. Tomorrow, there are only physics and will. I've mastered the physics. She paused, and, for the first time since he'd met her, Silent smiled. It was a cold expression that held no warmth, only absolute confidence in her ability to deliver death across an impossible distance. And my will has never failed. The darkness before dawn was absolute when Silent began her final approach to the shooting position she had selected during her reconnaissance. Unlike the 12 previous attempts by military snipers, she had chosen a location that defied conventional tactical wisdom. While others had sought elevated positions with clear sightlines, Silent had identified a depression in the rocky terrain that most would consider impossible for such a long-range shot. Her reasoning was characteristically precise. The position offered concealment from enemy observers, protection from the desert winds that could affect bullet trajectory, and, most importantly, an angle of approach that her target would never expect. After studying the enemy sniper's patterns for 2 days, Silent understood that he watched for threats from obvious positions. She would come from somewhere he wasn't looking. The journey to her chosen position required a 3-kilometer movement through hostile territory. Silent traveled light, carrying only her rifle, minimal ammunition, and survival gear. Her movement through the darkness was so fluid and silent that even the desert wildlife continued their normal activities around her. She had learned long ago that the secret to remaining undetected wasn't just about moving quietly, but about moving naturally, becoming part of the environment rather than an intruder within it. By 0400 hours, Silent had reached her position and begun the meticulous process of preparing for the shot. She cleared a small area of loose stones and debris, creating a stable platform for her rifle. Every movement was deliberate and economical, conserving energy for the moment when absolute stillness would mean the difference between success and failure. The rifle she had selected was an older model that most modern snipers had abandoned in favor of newer technology. But Silent knew this weapon intimately. She had carried it through conflicts in 3 different countries, and it had never failed her when precision mattered most. The barrel was hand-selected for consistency, the trigger adjusted to break at exactly 3 pounds of pressure, and the scope mounted with mathematical precision. As the sky began to lighten, Silent began her final preparations. She consulted a small weather station, noting that wind speed was holding steady at 8 miles per hour from the southwest. Temperature was rising slowly, which would affect air density and, therefore, bullet trajectory. She made minute adjustments to her scope to compensate for these variables. The experimental ammunition she had requisitioned represented the cutting edge of ballistic technology. Each bullet was manufactured to tolerances measured in fractions of thousandths of an inch. The powder charge was weighed to the nearest tenth of a grain. These rounds were designed for shots that pushed the absolute limits of what was possible with rifle fire. At 0800 hours, Silence settled into her final shooting position. She would remain motionless for the next hour and 42 minutes, waiting for the precise moment when all variables aligned for the perfect shot. This level of patience and physical control had been developed through years of training that few people could endure. Her breathing slowed to a rhythm that would maintain optimal blood oxygen levels while minimizing any movement that could affect her aim. Her heart rate dropped to a pace that eliminated the pulse-induced tremor most shooters never learned to control. She became as still as the rocks around her, a human rifle rest focused on a single purpose. Through her scope, Silent could see the enemy position clearly despite the extreme distance. The magnification was so high that heat mirages became a significant factor, creating visual distortions that could throw off even experienced marksmen. She had learned to read these mirages like a language, using them to gauge wind conditions at different points along the bullet's flight path. At 0930, movement appeared in the enemy position. Silent watched as her target began his daily routine, unaware that death was observing him from nearly 3 kilometers away. She noted his movements, confirming the patterns she had identified during her 2 days of observation. He was methodical, professional, and, unfortunately for him, predictable. The enemy sniper moved with the confidence of someone who had dominated this battlefield for weeks. He had killed 15 soldiers and driven off 12 counter-sniper teams. In his mind, he was untouchable at his current position. The distance was too great, the approach routes too exposed, and his concealment too effective. He had become comfortable, which was exactly what Silent had been waiting for. At 0940, the enemy marksman began scanning for targets through his own scope. Silent could see the glint of his optics as he searched for American soldiers foolish enough to expose themselves. She knew he would fire within the next 5 minutes, just as he had done every morning for 2 weeks. Silent made her final adjustments to scope elevation and windage. The calculations in her head were complex equations involving ballistic coefficients, atmospheric pressure, temperature gradients, and the Coriolis effect caused by the Earth's rotation. At 2,670 meters, even these seemingly minor factors could cause a complete miss. Her breathing settled into the final rhythm. 3 slow breaths to oxygenate her blood, then, a controlled exhale to empty her lungs. Her finger found the trigger and applied the first stage of pressure. The rifle was now ready to fire with the slightest additional pressure from her index finger. Through the scope, Silent watched her target settle into his own shooting position. She could see him scanning the American positions below, searching for his next victim. His routine was exactly as she had predicted. His timing was perfect. His position was exactly where she needed it to be. The wind conditions were optimal. The temperature had stabilized. The atmospheric pressure was steady. Every variable that could affect a bullet's flight over nearly 3 kilometers was within acceptable parameters. At 0941:47, the enemy sniper found his target. Silent watched him prepare for his shot, knowing that in moments he would kill another American soldier. She could see his rifle swing slightly as he tracked his chosen victim. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Her target was focused entirely on his own shot, his attention completely absorbed by his intended victim below. He was as still as he would ever be, settled into his shooting position with his full concentration directed away from any possible threat. Silent applied the final pressure to her trigger. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding rocks. The bullet began its journey across the desert, traveling at over 2,800 feet per second toward a target nearly 3 kilometers away. For the next 2.7 seconds, everything depended on physics, precision, and the countless hours of preparation that had led to this moment. The bullet flew through varying air densities, crosswinds, and temperature gradients that would challenge even the most advanced ballistic computers. Silent remained motionless, watching through her scope as the bullet traveled toward its target. At this distance, she could actually track the projectile's path by watching for the slight disturbance it created in the heat mirages. She counted the seconds, knowing exactly when impact should occur. At 2.7 seconds after firing, Silent watched her target collapse. The bullet had found its mark with surgical precision, ending weeks of terror with a single, perfectly placed shot. The enemy sniper who had killed 15 American soldiers would never fire again. Silent observed the position for another 30 seconds, confirming that the threat was eliminated. Then, she began the methodical process of packing her equipment and preparing for extraction. Her mission was complete, and it was time to disappear as silently as she had arrived. The bullet's journey across 2,670 meters of hostile desert took exactly 2.7 seconds, but those seconds seemed to stretch into eternity for everyone watching from the American positions. General Morrison stood in his command post, surrounded by officers who had gathered to witness what they all hoped would be the end of their nightmare. Radio silence had been maintained to avoid any interference with Silent's mission, leaving them to wait in tense quiet. Captain Rodriguez monitored the situation from a forward observation post, his binoculars trained on the distant enemy position. Even with military-grade optics, the target was barely visible as a small speck among the rocks. The fact that Silent was attempting to eliminate a threat at such an impossible distance seemed like something from a movie rather than reality. Through his earpiece, Rodriguez heard the sharp crack of Silent's rifle echoing across the desert. He immediately focused on the enemy position, waiting to see if the impossible had actually occurred. For several long seconds, nothing seemed to change. The enemy sniper's position appeared undisturbed, exactly as it had for the past 2 weeks. Then, Rodriguez saw it. A subtle change in the shadows, a stillness that was different from before. The enemy marksman who had moved with lethal precision just moments earlier was no longer visible in his firing position. "Command, this is Rodriguez," he whispered into his radio. "I think we have confirmation. The target appears to be down." In the command post, General Morrison felt his pulse quicken. After 12 failures and 15 casualties, it seemed impossible that their ordeal could end with a single shot from an unknown contractor. Yet the preliminary reports suggested that Silent had achieved something that military experts had deemed nearly impossible. The confirmation came 20 minutes later when drone surveillance flew over the enemy position. The high-resolution cameras revealed what ground observers could only guess at. The enemy sniper lay motionless in his fortified position, eliminated by a headshot of surgical precision. The bullet had traveled nearly 3 kilometers and found its target with an accuracy that defied everything military strategists knew about long-range marksmanship. Word of the successful mission spread through the camp with the speed of desert wildfire. Soldiers who had lived in fear for 2 weeks emerged from their protective positions, hardly daring to believe that their tormentor was finally gone. The relief was palpable, mixing with an awe that bordered on disbelief. But, while the camp celebrated, Silent had already begun her extraction. By the time confirmation of the successful shot reached General Morrison, she was halfway back to the base, moving with the same ghostly efficiency that had brought her to the shooting position. She carried her equipment with casual ease, as if she had just completed a routine training exercise rather than one of the most difficult shots in military history. Sergeant Williams was the first to spot her returning through the perimeter checkpoint. He had been part of the armory team that had questioned her equipment choices, and seeing her return safely filled him with a mixture of relief and professional curiosity. "How did it go?" he asked as Silent passed her weapon to him for post-mission inspection. "Target eliminated," she replied with typical brevity. Williams examined the rifle, noting that only one round had been fired. The precision required to succeed with a single shot at that distance was beyond anything he had encountered in 20 years of military service. Most snipers would have fired multiple rounds to ensure success, adjusting their aim based on the impact of previous shots. Silent had needed only one. "That's incredible shooting," Williams said. "The range alone puts this shot in the record books." Silent paused in gathering her gear, looking at the sergeant with an expression that might have been curiosity. "Records? Ma'am, what you just did, there's maybe a handful of people in the world who could make that shot. And most of them couldn't do it under combat conditions." She seemed genuinely puzzled by his excitement. "It was just ballistics and preparation. The physics don't care about difficulty." This matter-of-fact response to achieving the seemingly impossible was typical of Silent's personality. She approached extraordinary feats with the same calm professionalism that others might bring to routine tasks. Excellence, for her, was simply a matter of proper preparation and execution. General Morrison arrived at the armory 15 minutes later, accompanied by several staff officers and what appeared to be intelligence personnel. The general's relief was visible on his weathered face, but there was also something else, a deep curiosity about the woman who had just solved his impossible problem. "Outstanding work," Morrison said. "The entire command is grateful for what you've accomplished here." Silent nodded acknowledgement but offered no verbal response. She seemed more interested in completing her equipment checkout than in receiving praise for her achievement. "There will be questions," Morrison continued. "Higher command will want a detailed debrief. The Pentagon will want to understand how this mission succeeded where others failed." "I filed my report with intelligence," Silent said, indicating a thin folder she had placed on the armory counter. "Technical details, environmental conditions, equipment performance. Everything relevant is documented." Morrison picked up the report, noting its unusual brevity. Most after-action reports from such significant missions would be dozens of pages long. Silent's report was barely 3 pages, written in precise, clinical language that focused solely on technical aspects of the mission. "This is rather concise," he observed. "I included everything that mattered." One of the intelligence officers, a colonel whom Morrison didn't recognize, stepped forward. "Ms. Silent, there will be recognition for this achievement. Medal recommendations, possibly media attention. This shot will go down in military history." For the first time since Morrison had met her, Silent showed something approaching emotion. Not pleasure or pride, but something closer to alarm. "That won't be necessary," she said firmly. Or acceptable? The intelligence colonel looked confused. I'm sorry? No medals. No media. No recognition. Silent's voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before. That was a condition of my participation. Morrison remembered their initial conversation, when Silent had mentioned that if she did her job correctly, nobody would know she was there. At the time, he had thought it was just professional humility. Now he realized she had been completely serious. But, this achievement, the colonel began. Remains classified, Silent interrupted. My contract specifies complete operational anonymity. No exceptions. The intelligence personnel exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. They had witnessed a historic achievement in marksmanship, but their star performer was refusing any acknowledgement of her success. General Morrison understood, though he couldn't entirely approve. Silent was a contractor, not a soldier seeking career advancement. She had completed her mission with devastating effectiveness and now wanted to disappear back into whatever shadows she had emerged from. What about operational lessons learned? Morrison asked. Training protocols that could help other marksmen? Silent considered this for a moment. The fundamentals don't change. Proper preparation, understanding your equipment, patience. Anyone can learn the technical aspects. But, not everyone can execute like you did. She shrugged slightly, as if dismissing the importance of her extraordinary skill. Most people don't need to. As the group prepared to leave the armory, Morrison realized that he still knew virtually nothing about the woman who had just saved his command. She remained as much of an enigma after her success as she had been when they first met. Will you be staying with the unit? He asked. Silent shook her head. My contract here is complete. I have other obligations. Other operations? She looked at him with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. There are always targets that need eliminating, General. The distance just varies. With that cryptic response, Silent gathered her remaining equipment and walked toward the base exit. Morrison watched her go, knowing that he was witnessing the departure of perhaps the most skilled marksman he would ever encounter. Within hours, she would disappear as completely as if she had never existed, leaving behind only the memory of an impossible shot and the lives she had saved. The legend of the 2,670-meter shot would persist in military circles, but the woman who made it would remain forever silent. 3 months after Silent disappeared from the desert base, General Morrison received a phone call that changed everything he thought he knew about the mysterious contractor who had saved his command. The call came from a Pentagon intelligence official whose clearance level was so high that Morrison had never heard of the department he represented. General Morrison, we need to discuss the contractor known as Silent, the voice said without preamble. Specifically, we need to understand exactly what happened during her operation at your base. Morrison felt a chill of concern. Is there a problem? Her mission was completely successful. The threat was eliminated with no collateral damage. That's exactly the problem, General. According to our records, there is no contractor by that designation currently working with any military unit. There never has been. The revelation hit Morrison like a physical blow. That's impossible. She was cleared through intelligence channels. She had proper credentials. General, I'm looking at the complete personnel manifest for your base during that time period. No contractor matching her description was ever assigned to your unit. Her credentials, if she had any, were not issued by any agency we can identify. Morrison sank into his chair, his mind racing through the implications. If Silent wasn't an authorized contractor, then who was she? How had she gained access to a secure military facility? And, more troubling, what had been her real motivation for eliminating the enemy sniper? Are you suggesting she was some kind of infiltrator? Morrison asked. We're not sure what to suggest, General. That's why we're calling. We need you to tell us everything you remember about her. Over the next hour, Morrison recounted every detail of his interactions with Silent. Her sudden appearance, her incredible skills, her refusal of recognition, and her equally mysterious departure. As he spoke, he began to realize how little he actually knew about the woman who had changed everything. "Did she ever mention previous operations?" the intelligence officer asked. "No, but there were hints. She spoke about knowing her rifle from previous conflicts. The way she moved, the way she assessed situations, she was definitely experienced. We've been checking with Allied intelligence services. The description you've provided matches reports of a female operative who has appeared in conflict zones around the world over the past 5 years. Different names, different cover identities, but always the same result: impossible shots that eliminate high-value targets." Morrison felt his understanding of the situation shift completely. "Are you saying she's some kind of assassin?" "We're saying she's a ghost, General. Someone who appears when needed, completes missions that others can't, then vanishes without a trace. The question is, who is she working for?" This question haunted Morrison for weeks after the call ended. He found himself replaying every conversation with Silent, looking for clues about her true identity and motivation. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that she had never actually claimed to be working for American interests. She had simply appeared when needed and solved their problem. Captain Rodriguez, when told about the Pentagon's inquiries, had his own disturbing revelation. "Sir, I've been thinking about how she knew so much about our enemy sniper. The details she provided about his equipment, his patterns, even his physical characteristics. How could she have learned all that from just 2 days of observation?" Morrison had wondered about this himself. Silent's knowledge of the enemy marksman had been remarkably complete, far beyond what should have been possible from distant surveillance. She said she went into enemy territory for reconnaissance, Morrison remembered. Got close enough to count his spare magazines. But that would have been incredibly dangerous, sir. And the level of infiltration required, it suggests capabilities beyond even our best special operations personnel. The more they discussed it, the more questions arose. How had Silent known about their sniper problem in the first place? How had she gained access to classified information about failed counter-sniper missions? And, most disturbing of all, if she could infiltrate enemy positions so easily, what prevented her from doing the same to American forces? 6 months later, Morrison received another call, this time from a different intelligence agency. They had been tracking reports of a female sniper operating in Eastern Europe, eliminating targets at extreme ranges with the same surgical precision that had characterized the desert operation. "General, we believe your Silent has surfaced again. This time she eliminated a war criminal who had been hiding under international protection. Single shot, impossible distance, no witnesses." "Is she working for us?" Morrison asked. "We don't think she's working for anyone, sir. Best we can determine, she operates independently, choosing her own targets based on criteria we can't identify." This revelation was both reassuring and terrifying. If Silent was operating as some kind of independent agent of justice, eliminating threats that conventional forces couldn't touch, then perhaps her intervention at Morrison's base had been motivated by genuine desire to help. But it also meant that an individual of extraordinary capabilities was operating outside any command structure or oversight. Over the following year, reports of Silent's activities began to form a pattern. She appeared in conflict zones around the world, always targeting individuals who posed significant threats to innocent lives. War criminals, terrorist leaders, rogue snipers like the one who had terrorized Morrison's base. Her victims were universally people that the international community wanted eliminated but couldn't touch through conventional means. General Morrison began to understand that he had witnessed something far more significant than just an exceptional shot. He had encountered a legend in the making, a figure who would become the subject of whispered stories in military circles around the world. The shot at 2,670 meters wasn't just a display of marksmanship, it was a calling card from someone who had appointed herself as judge, jury, and executioner for those who killed innocents from the shadows. The soldiers who had served at Morrison's base during Silent's brief appearance began to tell stories. They spoke of the mysterious woman who had saved their lives with an impossible shot, then vanished like smoke. The stories grew with each telling, as military legends always do, but the core remained unchanged. Somewhere in the world was a woman who could reach out across impossible distances and eliminate evil with surgical precision. Morrison never saw Silent again, but he followed the reports of her activities with professional interest and personal gratitude. She had saved his command when no one else could, asking for nothing in return except anonymity. In a world where heroes often demanded recognition and reward, Silent sought only the satisfaction of eliminating threats to innocent lives. Years later, when Morrison retired from military service, he was asked about the most remarkable operation he had ever witnessed. He would tell the story of the mysterious contractor who made an impossible shot to save his soldiers, but he never revealed her true nature. Some legends, he realized, were better left as mysteries. The desert wind still blows across that remote base, but it no longer carries the smell of fear. Soldiers stationed there sometimes ask about the stories they've heard, about the woman who made the impossible shot. Their officers tell them it's just another military legend, one of many stories that grow in the telling. But, late at night, when the desert is quiet and the stars shine with crystalline clarity, some say you can still hear the echo of that single shot that traveled 2,670 meters to deliver justice. And, somewhere in the world, Silent continues her work, appearing when needed, eliminating threats that others cannot touch, then disappearing back into the shadows from which legends are born. The general had requested a marksman, and, after 12 failed attempts, he had received something far more than he bargained for. He had encountered a force of nature disguised as a woman, a ghost who served justice rather than any flag or nation. The shot at 2,670 meters would be remembered as one of the greatest achievements in military history, but the woman who made it would remain forever what she had chosen to be: silent, unknown, and unstoppable.